The year was 1540, and the Tudor court glittered with danger disguised as luxury. Behind the silks and songs, beneath the scent of rosewater and ambition, one young woman's fate was being quietly sealed. Who was this young girl? Her name was Catherine Howard, barely 17, radiant, and unaware that she was walking into history's deadliest love story. She was not born to be queen, yet in a kingdom ruled by a man known for executing his wives, her laughter, innocence, and beauty would become both her crown and her curse. To Henry VIII, she was youth reborn, his final chance at love and passion. To others, she was a pawn in the endless game of power. Welcome to various eras in time. Now let's begin with this story. This is not just the story of a queen who fell from grace. It is the story of how love became treason and how silence became survival. But what if Catherine Howard was not as naive as history remembers? What if the doomed fifth wife of Henry VIII understood the game all along and simply ran out of time? Before she was queen, Catherine Howard was a girl of laughter and light, a bloom growing in the shaded corners of history. Born around 1523, the daughter of a lesser noble, her life began not in royal luxury, but in uncertainty. Her father, a man burdened by debt and faded pride, left her to be raised in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. It was a house filled with young attendants, idle chatter, and the intoxicating freedoms that could ruin a girl before she even knew what danger was. There, in that lively chaos, Catherine learned the language of charm. She played the lute, danced with grace, and smiled in ways that made people feel seen. To the world, she appeared untouched by the grim shadows of Tudor politics. Yet beneath that sweetness was a world brimming with whispers, a courtly finishing school where innocence met intrigue. Every look was a lesson, every compliment a test. The Tudor court was a labyrinth of ambition, and women were its brightest and most fragile ornaments. Catherine's beauty was her invitation into that glittering world, but also her warning. At 14, she already understood the power of presence, how laughter could smooth over uncertainty, and how silence could conceal fear. When she arrived as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, few noticed her presence, yet the courtiers did. Her youth was magnetic, her smile disarming. They called her the Little Rose of the court. In a palace ruled by suspicion, she was a breath of something tender and new. But the petals that open too early are the first to wilt. Catherine's charm would soon draw not just admiration, but the gaze of a king restless for affection. What began as music and laughter would soon turn into the quiet rhythm of danger. The Tudor court was more than a seat of power. It was a theatre of desire. Every glance, every dance, every whispered secret carried consequences. For a young woman like Catherine Howard, beauty was both an armor and a trap. She had stepped into a palace where loyalty was fluid, truth was dangerous, and affection could turn fatal before the ink dried on a royal decree. Henry VIII's court shimmered with brilliance and peril. The air itself seemed charged with ambition. Nobles bowed with grace while plotting vengeance in their hearts. Courtiers dressed like peacocks, each competing for the king's fleeting attention. Music echoed through marble halls, laughter masked fear, and behind the perfumed corridors, one truth was known to all. The closer you stood to the throne, the sharper the blade above your neck. Catherine, young and unseasoned, became the court's newest fascination. Her charm wasn't calculated. It was natural, unguarded. Yet in the royal court, innocence was a spectacle. Men watched her closely. Women whispered her name. Her lineage tied her to the powerful Howard family, a clan hungry to restore influence lost after Anne Boleyn's fall. They saw in Catherine an opportunity, a way to regain what ambition had cost them. The Howard family understood the rules of survival. Beauty could open doors that bloodlines could not, and so they guided her gently but deliberately into the king's orbit. Henry, now aging and embittered by failed marriages, longed for the vitality of youth, for a woman whose laughter might drown out the echoes of regret. Catherine's brightness was irresistible, a reminder of the man he once was. Yet as her presence began to draw attention, so too did it attract danger. In a world where queens were chosen and discarded like pawns, desire could transform overnight into suspicion. Catherine's smile, once her greatest weapon, was slowly becoming a mark of destiny. The stage was set, the courtiers watched, and the king, restless and wounded, was about to notice the girl who would change everything. The walls of the Tudor court were alive with murmurs, soft, calculated, and dangerous. Every word carried weight, every whisper traveled faster than truth. In those corridors of ambition, Catherine Howard's name began to circulate not as a girl of charm, but as a potential instrument of power. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, recognized the rare chance before him. His family had fallen from grace after his niece, Anne Boleyn, had been executed by the same king they still served. Now the Howards sought redemption, and Catherine was their unwitting vessel. To the Duke, the king's dissatisfaction with Anne of Cleves was not a scandal, it was an opportunity. Henry's fourth marriage, arranged for politics and alliance, had brought him no joy. He found Anne plain, uninspiring, and foreign to his desires. The court buzzed with gossip about the king's disappointment, and Norfolk knew it would only take one spark to ignite change. Catherine was that spark, young, lively, and everything Anne was not. Her placement in Queen Anne's household had been no accident. The Howards manoeuvred carefully, ensuring Catherine would be visible but unassuming, alluring but seemingly innocent. The Duke whispered in sympathetic ears, reminding courtiers of the family's loyalty and Catherine's virtue. Meanwhile, Catherine, oblivious to the full scope of the plan, moved through court like sunlight, warming everyone she touched, unaware of the shadows gathering behind her. It began as glances exchanged in corridors, moments that lingered too long. Henry, now nearing 50, found himself captivated by the young maid who smiled without calculation, whose laughter felt genuine in a world of masks. The court took notice, and so did the Howards. Behind every innocent encounter, strategies were forming, alliances tightening, and eyes watching. The whispers grew louder. Servants traded stories, courtiers speculated in hushed tones, and the Duke waited patiently for the moment when those whispers would reach the king's ear. In a palace where love was strategy and silence was survival, Catherine Howard's name had become more than a rumour. It had become a plan. It began, as so many tragedies do, with a glance that lasted too long. King Henry VIII, swollen with power but haunted by disappointment, had grown tired of arranged affections. His heart, once fierce and unrelenting, now limped with regret and bitterness. Yet when he saw Catherine Howard, all that weariness seemed to lift for a moment. She moved like a melody, laughter spilling through the chambers of his palace like sunlight through stained glass. To him, she was not just a woman, she was a promise of renewal, of youth regained, of redemption for the wounds of time. Catherine, untrained in the ways of royal hearts, could not have known how dangerous it was to charm a king who had buried wives before her. Her smile was unguarded, her presence effortless. But to Henry, that very innocence was intoxicating. She did not flatter him with fear, she made him feel adored. For a monarch used to obedience and caution, that spark of spontaneity was irresistible. The courtiers watched as the king's attention shifted. His conversations grew longer, his eyes lingered, his mood lifted. When Catherine passed, the world around him seemed to fade. The court understood what this meant before Catherine herself did. The king's eye had chosen. The Howards, ever perceptive, fanned the flame. They whispered reminders of Catherine's virtue, her sweetness, her grace, each word feeding Henry's growing obsession. The Duke of Norfolk knew that power never lingered long in one place. and soon the crown's gaze would tilt again toward their family. By summer's end, Henry's affection for his young lady-in-waiting had become a courtly secret, too loud to conceal. Gifts began to appear, jewels, silks, and letters written in the trembling hand of a man twice her age, but desperate to feel alive. The Queen, Anne of Cleves, faded quietly into the background, unaware that her marriage was already over. The court buzzed with anticipation, and Catherine, still radiant and unguarded, stood at the center of a game whose rules she did not yet understand, her smile now a crown she had not asked to wear. The summer of 1540 shimmered with promise, but behind the gilded pageantry, a storm was forming. Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves had collapsed in embarrassment and political tension. Yet, as swiftly as the ink was dried on the annulment, another love story, or perhaps another illusion of it, was being written. Barely weeks after freeing himself from Anne, the king took Catherine Howard as his fifth wife. She was only 17. He was nearly 50. The wedding, held in secret on July 28th, was cloaked in both joy and unease. The courtiers bowed, smiled, and celebrated. But their eyes whispered the truth. Youth had replaced power, beauty had replaced diplomacy, and once again the king had gambled his heart. To Henry, Catherine was redemption. After years of political marriages and bitter losses, she represented the warmth of affection he believed he'd been denied. He called her his rose without thorns, a poetic vision of purity that masked the complexity of her situation. To the kingdom, she was a symbol of hope, the young queen who might bring laughter back to the aging monarch. But for Catherine, the crown was both a dream and burden. The silks, jewels, and ceremonies dazzled her, yet beneath their splendor lay invisible chains. Every gesture was now scrutinized, every word carried weight. Her movements were tracked by courtiers eager for favor, her behavior whispered about by rivals. The Queen's apartments, once symbols of triumph, quickly became a gilded cage. The King's affection, though tender at first, soon revealed its possessive shadow. Henry's health was failing, his leg ulcer tormented him, his moods grew erratic. Catherine's youth, once a comfort, now became a cruel mirror, reminding him of the vigor he had lost. And still, the court smiled. The musicians played, the banquets glittered, and the king's laughter echoed through the halls. But beneath every note was tension, the quiet awareness that joy in Henry's court never lasted. The crown had been placed upon her head. Yet, with every passing day, it grew heavier. Every queen carries secrets, but in Catherine Howard's case, hers were not forged from malice, they were born from youth. Long before the crown, before the silks and courtiers, Catherine had been a lively girl in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. There, surrounded by other young attendants, discipline had been loose, temptation abundant, and innocence fleeting. The Duchess's home was less a fortress of virtue than a stage for reckless flirtations. In those years, Catherine's laughter had drawn attention from tutors, musicians, and fellow wards. One such man, Henry Manox, her music teacher, had shown her the dangerous difference between admiration and manipulation. Their relationship, though secret, left traces, notes, tokens, words never meant to reach the eyes of kings. Later came Francis Dereham, a bold and ambitious man whose intimacy with Catherine would one day be twisted into treason. These encounters were the follies of youth forgotten by all, except history. For when the past belongs to a queen, it never truly disappears. At first, no one at court spoke of it aloud. The Howards worked to bury every rumor, sealing away anything that could tarnish the family's rise. Yet, among servants and rivals, stories lingered. Stories of a young woman whose innocence was not as unblemished as the king believed. To Henry, Catherine was purity itself, his rose without thorns. To the court, she was a girl with a past best left unspoken. But secrets in the Tudor world have a way of surviving, waiting, festering, resurfacing when least expected. A careless word, a familiar face, a servant's confession. It would take only one to unravel her. For now, Catherine lived as though her past had vanished, believing that love and laughter had rewritten her story. But history, relentless in its memory, was already turning its page backward. The dark secrets she had left behind in Lambeth were stirring, and they would not remain silent for long. As summer ripened into autumn, the Tudor court seemed at ease once more. The king, soothed by youth and affection, called his young queen "my jewel of joy." Music drifted through the halls again, and for a time, peace reigned. But peace, in Henry VIII's world, was a fragile illusion, one that rarely survived the return of memory. In the midst of this calm, a familiar name resurfaced: Francis Dereham. The same man who had once whispered promises of devotion to Catherine during her girlhood now returned, emboldened by her crown. Whether driven by arrogance or longing, Dereham sought her out, reminding her of the bond they once shared. To him, she was not the Queen of England, but the girl he had once held in secret. To Catherine, his reappearance was both a comfort and a terror, a reminder of the part of her life she thought buried. She made a grave mistake, one born not of deceit, but of fear. Believing she could silence suspicion by controlling the narrative, Catherine appointed Dereham to her household, giving him a modest position near her circle. To the outside world, it seemed harmless. To the watching courtiers, it seemed reckless. Catherine's motives were likely innocent, an attempt to shield her secret from dangerous tongues. But in a palace built on rumor, no innocence could withstand perception. Her attendants began to whisper. Why was this man so close to the Queen? Why did he speak to her with such familiarity? Each glance, each moment shared, became another thread in a web she could no longer control. Meanwhile, Henry remained oblivious. His affection blinded him to the shifting glances around him. To him, Catherine was still the embodiment of virtue, the balm to his weary soul. But beneath the gilded surface of royal affection, the seeds of downfall were taking root. Catherine had brought her past into her present, and in doing so she had unknowingly set her future to doom. Whispers travel faster than truth in a palace built on secrets. By the autumn of 1541, the Tudor court had grown restless. Beneath the golden surface of banquets and dances, a silent network of rumor began its slow, deliberate work. Every servant, every attendant, every passing word was a threat, and soon those threats would entangle Queen Catherine Howard in a web too intricate to escape. The court was a place where loyalty shifted like sand. Ambitious men and jealous women had long watched Catherine's swift ascent with suspicion. Her youth, her laughter, her effortless charm, all had once delighted them. Now they stung like reminders of their own fading influence. Among them were figures eager to exploit her past for their own advantage, to turn whispers into weapons. It began innocently enough, a servant recalling stories from her days at the Dowager Duchess's household, another noting Dereham's bold familiarity with the Queen. One by one, these fragments found their way to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a man who understood the dangerous gravity of royal scandal. The information could not be ignored. Meanwhile, the Howards grew uneasy. They sensed the danger, but dared not act openly. To confront the rumors would only draw the king's attention. To ignore them would be fatal. Catherine, caught between fear and naivety, believed she could still control the story. She dismissed the gossip as envy, trusting in her husband's affection, a fatal miscalculation. Behind closed doors, the council began its quiet investigation. Cranmer, cautious yet determined, gathered testimonies, letters, and witnesses. Each confession, each whispered recollection, became another knot in the Queen's unraveling fate. Outside, the court continued to sparkle with feasts and finery. Inside, beneath the laughter and candlelight, Betrayal was already blooming. The courtiers who once bowed before Catherine now waited for the moment her crown would tremble. And in the midst of it all, the young queen smiled, unaware that the dark web had already closed around her. Autumn had turned cold when the truth, or what the court believed to be truth, finally reached the king. The day began like any other, with the sounds of hunting horns and laughter echoing across Hampton Court Palace. But by nightfall, silence reigned. Archbishop Cranmer, trembling yet resolute, placed before Henry a letter, a confession not of treason, but of shame. Inside were the words that would destroy Catherine Howard. It told of youthful indiscretions, of men like Francis Derham, who had once called her his wife by pre-contract. It whispered of her past, of stolen moments and hidden affection long before she ever met the king. To most, these would have been sins of foolish youth. But to Henry VIII, a man who had been betrayed, humiliated and hardened by loss, it was unforgivable. At first he refused to believe it. His rose without thorns could not have deceived him. But as the council pressed the evidence forward, doubt clawed its way into his heart. Every kindness she had shown, every hesitation in her voice, every glance away, all were now colored by suspicion. Rage followed disbelief. Henry locked himself in his chambers, refusing food, cursing God and man alike. The courtiers dared not speak her name. Catherine, meanwhile, was left in darkness. Surrounded by her attendants, she sensed the shift before she was told. The king's visits ceased. Her letters went unanswered. Then, one morning, her royal seal was taken and her household dismissed. Panic crept in, the realization that love at court could vanish overnight. When the guards finally arrived, she pleaded innocence, insisting that her past had been buried before her marriage, that she had been loyal since the crown was hers. But the machinery of the Tudor state had already begun to turn. The laughter that once filled the palace was gone. In its place came the echo of footsteps, heavy, final, and closing in. The knock came before dawn. It was soft, almost courteous, but it carried the weight of death behind it. The guards of King Henry VIII entered Hampton Court Palace with solemn faces and lowered eyes. In their hands were orders sealed with the royal insignia, the command to arrest Queen Catherine Howard, fifth wife of the king. Catherine awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridors, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to servants or attendants, but to soldiers. When the door opened, the light from the hallway fell across her bed, and for the first time, she understood that her story as queen had ended. The men bowed, not out of respect, but ritual. She was no longer their sovereign, merely their charge. They informed her quietly and without ceremony that she was accused of adultery and deception. Her lips trembled as she denied it, her voice rising in disbelief. "I am no traitor," she insisted. "I have done no wrong since I became his wife." But the guard's silence told her the truth. Innocence no longer mattered. In Henry's England, accusation was guilty enough. The courtiers who had once adored her now avoided her gaze. The palace that had once glowed with her laughter now felt cold and hollow. Servants whispered behind closed doors, their pity mingling with fear. Catherine tried to write to the king, pleading for an audience, but her letters were intercepted. Henry refused to see her. His rage had transformed into something worse. The spiral of betrayal had hardened his heart and soul. Later that evening, as she was escorted from Hampton Court, the musicians played in the great hall for a banquet she was no longer welcome to attend. The irony was cruel. The celebration continued, but the queen was gone. Outside, the winter wind bit at her skin as the carriage doors shut behind her. The clatter of hooves echoed into the distance, carrying her towards Sion Abbey, and the slow unravelling of her final days. The Tower of London stood silent beneath a grey February sky, its ancient stones bearing witness to the ghosts of queens who came before. When Catherine Howard arrived, escorted through Traitor's Gate, the air was thick with dread and resignation. The same walls that had swallowed her cousin, Anne Boleyn, now closed around her. The chill of the river seeped through the stones, and with each echoing footstep, Catherine felt her courage falter. She was just 19, yet before the crown, before the accusations, before the fear, she had been simply a girl who wanted to be loved. Now, love had abandoned her. At first, she clung to hope. She believed Henry would see reason, that he would remember her laughter, her affection, her devotion. She begged for an audience, certain that if she could only look him in the eyes, his heart would forgive what his mind condemned. But Henry never came. The man who had once called her his rose without thorns now refused to speak her name. His rage had cooled into a cruel silence that left her trapped between hope and despair. Catherine's confessions, extracted under threat, were not of treason, but of youth, her foolish past, her carelessness, her fear. She admitted that she had been light in behavior, that she had loved unwisely before her marriage, but she swore that as queen, she had been faithful. The council recorded every word, twisting them into evidence of deceit. As the days passed, her composure faded. Witnesses spoke of her praying aloud for mercy, her voice trembling through the cold corridors. She asked forgiveness not just from her king, but from God, from her family, and from the nation she had shamed. And when her sentence was read, Catherine Howard bowed her head in quiet acceptance. Her fate was sealed. She had entered the Tower as a queen. She would leave it as history. Dawn broke cold and colourless over the Tower of London on February 13th, 1542. The sky hung heavy, as if mourning before the crowd did. Within her chamber, Catherine Howard prepared for death with the composure of someone who had already crossed into memory. Gone was the frightened girl who once wept for mercy. In her place stood a young woman resigned to history's judgment. They said she faced the end with calm dignity. She prayed quietly, her lips trembling as she asked forgiveness for her sins and for the pain her choices had caused the king. Those who attended her later swore she spoke no word of bitterness, only repentance, a final act of grace from a queen who had been denied it in life. When the guards led her to the scaffold, the courtyard fell silent. The crowd, hardened by years of spectacle, could not look away from the girl who had been both adored and condemned. The executioner bowed before her, and Catherine, barely 19, knelt upon the straw. "I die a queen," she whispered, "but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Whether those words were spoken or imagined, they became legend, a final echo of a heart that had dared to love in a world ruled by fear. The blade fell swiftly. The silence that followed was heavy, eternal. In that instant, her brief, bright life was extinguished. And yet, her devastating story carried on through history. Centuries later, her name still haunts the Tower's corridors. Some say her spirit runs through them, barefoot and weeping, still calling out for mercy that never came. The tragedy of innocence lost to ambition, in the warning her story leaves behind. Catherine Howard was not just a queen undone by love. She was a reminder that even in great palaces, a king's admiration can suddenly turn to tragedy. The betrayal of the heart and power once tasted always demands a price. Centuries have passed since Catherine Howard walked the halls of Hampton Court, yet her story still whispers through time. She was born into a world that valued beauty over wisdom, obedience over truth, and paid for it with her life. To the world, she remains a cautionary tale, the young queen who danced too close to danger. But perhaps she was something more. Beneath the legend, beyond the royal scandals, Catherine's story is a mirror of humanity, of longing, hope, and the desire to be seen. She lived in a time when silence was safe, when love could be treason, and when a girl's laughter could decide the course of empires. History has judged her as reckless, naive, or foolish. But what if she was none of these things? What if Catherine Howard was simply too modern for her time, too vividly, too honest, for a world that punished women for daring to feel carefree? The walls of the tower may have silenced her agonizing voice, begging for forgiveness, but not her story. And in that silence, she remains eternal, the fifth wife, the doomed queen, and a naive girl who loved a murderous king. Thank you for watching this video. Leave a comment if you think Catherine Howard deserves this tragic end. See you in the next video.